2020 is a tipping point. From China and the United States parting ways in the technology sphere, to social and political unrest in Latin America and India, to the challenge of a potentially contested U.S. presidential election, we see a mounting threat of global crisis. Eurasia Group has identified the top 10 risks of the year, the political, economic, and environmental factors impacting the world in ways we haven't seen for generations. Turkey's President Erdogan is no stranger to controversy and confrontation. In 2020, he faces unprecedented problems, especially deteriorating relations with the U.S., that will lead his nation to new lows. His popularity is declining, and his weakness will cause him to lash out. All this comes as Turkey faces financial strain caused by sanctions, leading to more political and economic instability.
There's a lot of anger in Latin America these days. Slow growth, corruption, and low-quality public services have raised social tensions in a region where a new and vulnerable middle class has high expectations. Countries as different as Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, and Ecuador all face tough decisions, as budget cuts and austerity measures could mean more protests and volatility in 2020.
U.S. policy toward the major Shia-led nations in the Middle East is imploding. That creates significant risks for regional stability, including a lethal conflict with Iran, upward pressure on oil prices, an Iraqi state that is either in Iran's orbit or failing, and a Syria fused to Moscow and Tehran.
Efforts to reverse climate change are not working. Today, we are on pace for a 3.5 degrees Celsius warming. That's a looming disaster for the planet and for millions of people, but governments can't agree on how to share the burden of fixing the problem. In 2020, it will become harder for companies to meet public expectations that they get greener. Investors and NGOs will pile on the pressure for action. There's also a risk of good old-fashioned public unrest. And if a warming planet triggers a natural disaster that disrupts national politics and economies, things will only get hotter.
Washington and Beijing won't like it, but Europe will become more assertive in 2020. On regulation, the EU's top antitrust official is battling North American tech giants. When it comes to trade, look for the EU to get tougher on China and to advance its climate goals by setting new rules with the threat of tariffs to enforce them. We won't see a European army, but EU leaders will use the world's largest internal market to break down cross-border barriers to military trade.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has already spent much of his second term promoting controversial social policies. His government has revoked special status for Jammu and Kashmir, stripped nearly 2 million people of their citizenship, and advanced a plan to make religion a factor in whether migrants can live and work in India. In 2020, he'll up the ante further, even as protests and unrest grow. This agenda will harm India's foreign relations and further hurt an already weakened economy.
Many believe multinational corporations can fill the gaps of global governance in a G0 world by stepping up to lead on climate change, poverty relief, and even trade. In fact, MNCs account for a quarter of worldwide employment, a third of global output, and more than half of global trade. But in 2020, governments will work to put a leash on many of these companies. Expect new data policies, higher taxes, new cyber standards, and more, creating a more challenging environment in the year ahead.
As the US and China go their separate ways in technology, we'll see a more explicit clash over national security, global influence, and values. The two sides will continue to use economic tools as their main weapons, things like sanctions, export controls, and boycotts, but they'll have shorter fuses and increasingly overt political goals. As tensions play out over trade policy, Taiwan, Hong Kong, human rights, and a host of other issues, other countries, as well as multinational businesses, will get caught in the crossfire.
The decision of the US and China to decouple in the technology sphere is the single most impactful trend for globalization since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The fissure is disrupting the flow of technology, talent, and investment between the two nations, and will expand beyond semiconductors, cloud computing, and 5G networks to impact media, entertainment, and academic research. As a virtual Berlin Wall goes up, which side will other countries choose?
In 2020, US political institutions will be tested in unprecedented ways. The nation faces the risk that the presidential election will be viewed as illegitimate, no matter who wins. Democrats will accuse Republicans of placing President Trump above the law and of using his presidential power to investigate his rivals. What's more, Washington will do little to stop outside election interference, especially from Russia. The uncertainty surrounding the election will take the US into uncharted political waters and send shockwaves across the world.